booktube, I'm the Book Mage, welcome back to my channel, and this is my October wrap-up. It feels wrong to think that we're in November, but I guess. So, sorry about the lighting in this video. If you haven't seen my most recent vlog, basically all the lighting in my room is broken except for my ring light. So this is also going to be, I think, a fairly quick wrap-up, I think, because I only really have 4 books to talk about, although they are all vampire books. The first one is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This one I actually read at like September time, but I don't think I wrapped it up, and this is the sequel to my official favourite book, which is Interview with the Vampire, and this is both a prequel, it's primarily a prequel, but little bits of this are also a sequel. It takes place both before and after Interview with the Vampire, so it's very difficult, but basically this follows the sort of life story of Lestat, who is a character from Interview with the Vampire, and I feel like he's Anne Rice's most like well-known character, which brings me to like the weirdest criticism I had about this book, in that if Lestat is kind of like Anne Rice's favourite and like the main character of like the overarching series, and this is the book with his name on it, so much of this is him listening to other vampires tell their life story. Each one of the books in this series so far is kind of like the vampire's autobiography, and yet Lestat's a good chunk of this book is taken up by him listening to the stories of other vampires that sort of exposit on like the vampire lore and mythology like of this universe that Anne Rice has built. While it was interesting, it wasn't really what I wanted to get out of this, because I think I would have liked more of Lestat doing things and not just Lestat sitting quietly and listening to somebody else's life story. So the first half of this book I enjoyed immensely, and it was like 5-star quality, but by the end it was kind of down to like a 4 stars. I will say it's still beautifully written, it's very gothic, and like at the beginning I enjoyed immensely. I do think, however, that this book is very clearly setting up for the next book, Queen of the Damned, and for like a wider mythos and like potential spin-offs for other characters, which I think she did go on to write. So that is kind of present in here as well, and I just think it dragged the book down a bit, at least for me personally. So this had so much potential to be a 5-star read, and it just wasn't. And I do have a whole vlog on me reading this, but honestly I probably ramble too much, so like if you listen to this wrap up, that's like all you need to know really. So from here on out, the next 3 books that I'm going to talk about were books that I read in October for like my big, I guess, like vampire reading extravaganza, which to be fair was smaller than I had anticipated, but I did have a lot of life things going on in October. Not limited to like the pipes in my house bursting and like flooding part of the landing, and then we had Storm Babette and a tree fell on my house, so I now no longer have a tree in my garden. So I will leave like my little October vlog up here if you want to go and like get like my full thoughts and feelings on the books like kind of in real time. I did also read these 3 comics in October, which I do talk about a bit in the vlog. I'm not going to wrap them up here because like I don't talk about manga or comics on this channel, other than to say the best thing I read all October was Fangs by Sarah Anderson, and this is like a tiny little vampire werewolf dating comic. I won't really talk about it here, but it was my favourite thing I read that month, so if you're still looking for something like spooky and vampy but like comedic, highly recommend that comic. So on to the actual books that I read. The first one was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I feel like at this point Grady Hendrix is a pretty like, he's a staple author for me. Like I know that if I buy his books I'm going to at least enjoy them or like be entertained. I've never rated anything he's done lower than a 3 stars, but I don't think I've ever given anything higher than a 4 either. I feel like with this one in particular I was a little bit underwhelmed. I think mainly because I'd been thinking this is a vampire book, so like where can it go? Like it has a lot of potential. Like I feel like this had potential to be my new favourite Grady Hendrix because vampires. And I do mention in the vlog a little bit that I feel like the reason that I wasn't as enamoured with this as I thought I would be was just because of the way vampires are portrayed in this. It's much more of like it's less classic vampire and more Grady Hendrix doing like a new, I guess like a bit of a different take on a vampire that feels very in keeping, to be honest, with what I expect from a Grady Hendrix novel, so I wasn't really too surprised, but I feel like the kind of vampy vibes that I thought could be in this weren't. So like I was thinking maybe something along the lines of like, you know, like the vibes from something like Lost Boys, but it was completely different. I still really enjoyed this. I thought it was really well written. It just ended up, I think, just not really being my favourite. I think I gave this like a 3 point something. It was definitely interesting and I'm glad that I've read it. I just don't think it gave me like the Halloween vampire vibes that I'd wanted. Honestly, I feel like I probably would have been better reading this in like the summertime. It is one that I would recommend. Like with all Grady Hendrix's books, this was a super quick read for me. It took me like, I think like a couple days to get through this. By no means bad, but it just wasn't what I wanted in the moment, I think. The next book that I picked up, and talk about a disappointment, and I am so sorry to say this, it is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. The main reason that I saved this for Halloween and October was because I was so confident that this was going to have these big, extravagant, like, luscious, over-the-top gothic vibes. I had thought it would be like that, but gothic, do you know what I mean? And I was just picturing like being set in Dracula's castle, because this is a retelling of Dracula and Dracula's brides. So I was so thinking we were going to get like this creeping, eerie, like vast castle atmosphere. And I think I had just been a little bit misled by the way I had heard a few people talk about this before, because while this is gothic in tone, this is written as a series of letters in retrospect from the main character, who is one of Dracula's brides, and she's writing these to Dracula after the fact of their relationship having ended. And this is a story mainly about a very toxic, abusive relationship that spans several centuries. So while you do start off in this sort of like ancient sort of castle, it very quickly sort of moves on from there, and you meet other characters, and they basically like they flit about different places in the world through different time periods. And so I feel like so much of the like classic atmosphere that I had been really craving just wasn't there, because this book wanted to go and explore other avenues, like other time periods and other locations and places. And I had also heard that this was a sapphic romance, and that is definitely present, and it is like, I wouldn't say it plays a massive role, to be honest, but it is present. And I just kind of thought that that would have been bigger and maybe more explored, and maybe this bigger, more emotional, more important plot point or journey, or the way that it was sort of introduced or described. But for the most part, the main relationship that is focused on is the one with Dracula. So there is also like the relationships between the brides, but the main one that is focused on is with Dracula, and how all of them relate to Dracula, who is never mentioned by name in this book, but it's heavily implied. So I feel like this was well written, and I feel like it is quite a good depiction of one particular type of abusive relationship. And so I have no complaints about what the book actually is. I just think that I went into this expecting something completely different, and all the reasons that I was excited to pick it up aren't actually things that are present in the book. Like when I was wanting these big grand descriptions and something really atmospheric, the book never really focuses on that. You get like little tidbits here and there, especially at the beginning. Like I will say the beginning couple chapters do kind of put you in that mood, but it moves on very swiftly from there, and you sort of move away from like all these very grand, like the sort of classical gothic descriptions you would expect, and it just moves on from there. And I had just really wanted more of that, and almost exclusively that. So I pretty much did in the end end up giving this like, I think just like a straight 3 stars. It was fine, but it didn't really give me anything. It didn't really give me anything that I personally really enjoyed, and I feel like maybe some of the reviewers I've heard talk about this, when they sort of praise just how gothic and like extravagantly gothic it is, I need to let you know, like, I'm goth 24/7, so I feel like the media that I consume sort of, I feel like if you consume a lot of goth media, it sort of puts into perspective how it's very mild on like the goth vibes and like the vampire vibes. I think it is one that I would still recommend. It is a good story, but for me it ended up just being like 3 stars worth of enjoyment, because I guess that's kind of on me, but it is what it is. Okay, and the last book that I read in October was The Golden by Lucia Shepherd. Now initially when I picked this up, I kind of assumed this was going to be a gothic vampire murder mystery set in like this giant sort of impossibly constructed big gothic vampire castle, and the basic plot is that all these different like branches of like this big vampire family have all gathered at this massive castle for this ceremonial decanting, which is basically where this one human who has been bred to have the most exquisite blood will be tasted by some of the very like exclusive higher ranking vampires, and it's like this big thing. But before that can happen, this human, who is called the Golden, is quite brutally murdered. Like, they are discovered very dead. And the task is given to a sort of fledgling vampire to basically figure out who is the culprit, who killed the Golden. Because of that, I had really assumed this would be like a classic sort of murder mystery, but set in a giant gothic vampire castle, which borders perfectly on like fantasy sci-fi kind of vibes. The book is not that. The basis for the plot is that the main character, whose name I think is Beheim, so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, it is French. When he was a human, he used to be like a detective, which is why he's been given this task. And while he does sort of go to a couple of like the vampire characters to basically interrogate them and look into things. For the most part, while the driving force behind him going places and doing things is that he needs to work out this murder, what I will say is it's nowhere near like a classic murder mystery in that you, the reader, can't technically work out who the culprit is based on what you learn in this. And the main reason for that is because obviously these are vampires and not humans, so all of their motives are very weird and strange, and they have to be given to you by the book, and all like the little clues that Behind picks up throughout the novel are usually things exclusive to like the vampires and the vampire lore and mythos within this book. Because these clues that are picked up are so ingrained in like the lore in this book, it very much has to be handed to you like what everything means. It's kind of done in a way where the clues themselves don't really lead to or mean anything. However, I will say personally it was also extremely easy to work out who the culprit was because you're only given a very, very small number of named characters, and after a little while it becomes very apparent, like quite early into the novel, that it really can only be one person if you list everyone out and you kind of rule out like who's the obvious red herring and who are the vampires that clearly just are there for like some background noise. There's like one character left and it's like, okay, so it's this one. The murder mystery aspect of this was the thing pulling the character through the story, but the majority of the story in this is a sort of transformation of the main character from his sort of fledgling, more human self. And then as he undertakes these, I won't call them trials, but as he goes through a lot of stuff throughout the course of the novel, he's told by several characters that his fledgling nature is bound to change, and it's almost described as like a metamorphosis, and it's that I think is more the story of this, which is where I say it gets into a lot of very esoteric, weird, almost like nonsensical cosmic horror-y magical stuff. And you're almost traversing this castle like a gauntlet. Like whenever they go to the next place, I have no idea if it's going to be like a vampire's boudoir or if they're going to set foot into like the 7th circle of hell or something. Like I have no idea what's going to happen. So it was not necessarily nonsensical, but it was written in the vibe it gave me. Was if you've ever played sort of really old like gauntlet style dungeon crawler games but like fantasy things like choose your own adventure style games where you like flick from page to page and like encounter to encounter, not quite D&D like I guess, but a little bit like that, or things like Death Trap Dungeon. Or also part of this gave me vibes of like, you know, in Hellraiser, like the films where they go to like the hell dimension and it's just weird stuff. That's what this feels like. It feels a little bit like playing one of those like fantasy video games or watching like parts of like the Hellraiser films. That is kind of what this setting gave me, and for that reason I ended up loving so much of this book. The vibes were immaculate. For Halloween, for October, this was the exact kind of overbearingly, like over the top, grandiose, gothic, vampire, horror, definitely very horror, castle that I was just like, yes, give it to me, put it in my brain. Like, I needed this book, and I am so glad that I picked this up specifically at October. Vibe-wise, it was perfect, and the prose in this as well is also it's very wordy, it's very verbose. I do think in the vlog, I spend like a good 30 seconds reading off 2 sentences because this man, he will take a whole paragraph to say like 2 words. This is very wordy, and it's written in, I would say, a high Alexis. I really appreciated it for that because one thing that I really like, sometimes I can just like a book for its prose and like the way that things are written, the words actually used on the page. In the same way that I can appreciate poetry, I can appreciate prose like that, and I really loved how this was written and the language used and just like the style of writing. I really enjoyed that. I will say I know for a fact it is definitely not for everyone. It's maybe an acquired taste, even if I feel like, personally I feel like it shows quite a high skill in writing, and it was honestly just nice to have a change with something that is, maybe you could describe it as a little bit overworked and a little bit overly wordy, but I personally really enjoyed it. One caveat that I do have for this book, to be honest, is, and I do mention this in the vlog as well, it is very much of its time with, I suppose there's not a terrible amount of sex and pornography in this book. It is horror and it is vampires, so like you're obviously going to have like sex in there, and it does not mean the same thing to vampires as it does to humans. It's just not treated the same. But I think every single female character in this has their breasts out, and I think described in at least some detail, at any possible chance there is. There are sometimes also naked men and like a description of like naked male parts or like a guy's ass, you know, but it's far more frequent for women to just be topless or just naked or sleeping with the main character. It is right of its time. That didn't really detract from my enjoyment. I kind of eye-rolled a few times, like, if you're going to describe like all these women's breasts, like at least give me like a man boob in there somewhere, you know, just for the equality of it all. But yeah, it didn't really detract from my enjoyment. I think this was written in like 93, so it is kind of like of an age, but if you can get past that and you like something that's, I would say, very well written, very verbose, but also esoteric and weird and just proper vampire gothic horror, I would recommend this one. To anyone else, because I realise that's like a niche group of people, to anyone else, I don't think I can really recommend this to like my general audience. But if you feel like you like a little bit dated horror, just for the way that vampires are written and like the unique little tidbits of vampire lore that you get in this that I thought was so interesting. There's just this hint of like potential magic powers that vampires have. Magic is never really described in this, but there are so many, there's like little sprinkles of people doing things that are like, I guess vampires do have magical powers, you know, or just like this innate ability that they have. It's so interesting. It's so interesting, and I would have loved to read anything else about vampires in this universe to just explore more about that, expand more on that. Yeah, I am kind of interested in reading other things by this author, but I don't know if he's done anything else with vampires, so I guess I'll have to see. I think I gave this, to rate it, I was so tempted to give it a 4 stars, but I feel parts of this did seem a little bit pointless and nonsensical, and I think I settled on like a 3.75, but for the sake of things like Goodreads, I think I'd rounded it to a 4 stars. But I think safe to say I was pleasantly surprised. Okay, and that is it. That is like everything I read in like basically the last 2 months. I kind of cannot really believe that I've only got November and December to go before like the end of the year. Like, this is my end of year reading now. Like, I do not have much time left. I really don't know where all this year has gone. Clearly not all to reading with the pitiful amount that I've read this year, but I don't know, I've got 2 months left, so I guess we'll see what I do with it. Otherwise, that is the end of my wrap-up. Do let me know if you guys have read any of these books and if you like have any thoughts on them. I will say, if you made it this far in the video, leave me like one of those kind of annoyingly cliche little vampire emojis. I hate these, but like, I've only read vampires, so like what else am I gonna have you leave me? And I guess I'll ask, what is either the very best or the very worst thing that you have read in October? I mean, I'm hoping you've read something really good, but if you've just read a really bad book that you want to rant about, let me know, because like, sometimes I like the salt. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!